Welcome to Animazing, the stories of Kevin Seymour. I am your host, Aramis, and this is episode 11 of the show. Stories from the Guyver Bio Booster Armor. So, first things first, I'm going to be changing up a few things. I am going to be doing less of a synopsis of the plot of the animes that I'm covering, and more so of the stories I've heard from said animes, production, and where they fit in the history of Kevin Seymour, animes, and before and after. I want to give a huge thank you to both Tom Fahn and Victor Garcia, some of the OGs of animes and LA Hero, and just overall amazing human beings that honestly were just fun to talk to nerd culture-wise, especially Victor. With that being said, before I even get to Guyver, I have to talk about before Guyver, specifically with Empire Entertainment. So, what do I mean by that? Essentially, you can sum up the formation of LA Hero, which is our precursor to Animaze Inc., with two places. Books Nippon, which was a manga store in California, run by Kevin Seymour, Robert Napton, also known as Bob Napton, and David Keith Riddick, while the other half came from the mailroom of Empire Entertainment, that being Victor Garcia, Tom Fahn, and somebody you may or may not know, which is Steve Blum. Now, there are other names, of course, and whenever I get into Guyver, I'll mention a bunch of the other OGs, but essentially these two groups came together, along with Ken Iyadomi, who was essentially the executive producer of the whole shebang, to start the craze that was Japanimation, now known more colloquially as anime. And the very first thing that they recorded may not have been the first to release, but the first to record was the Guyver Bio Boosted Armor. I believe it was called The Cave. It was one of the first recording studios before Magnitude 8 and before Les Claypool's house. And alongside Guyver was two more animes, and they are a mouthful. Super Dimension Century Orgus, which I will be calling Orgus, and Super Dimension Fortress Macross 2, Lovers Again, which I will be shortening to Macross 2, just for simplicity's sake. Now, these three were recorded basically simultaneously, so they'd record Guyver, then they go and record Orgus, then they go record Macross 2, and they cycle between these, starting from what I've been told by Tom Fahn and Victor Garcia. They started recording around 1991, and these released in 92. So a year of recording isn't bad. And for the time, the editing was really spot on, considering some of these were recorded in the same room. So if you don't know the issue with that, there can be a lot of audio bleeding. So if I'm recording my podcast here and my wife's talking in the other room, you're going to hear her audio bleed into my audio. So the way they do that now, and in most modern animes, they will record individually and to the point where there will not be any bleed through. So if dialogue ends, it is going to end before anyone else speaks. Which, just to get this out of the way, I think that makes audio feel less natural. Like, if I'm in a conversation with you and you start speaking near the tail end of my dialogue, that feels way more natural, way more human, and it's one of the reasons why I like a lot of the old 90s anime, especially the stuff Animaze worked on and LA Hero worked on. I'm listening to Victor Garcia's character speaking, and then I hear Tom's character speak over him. That is natural, especially for, in like Guyver's case, high school students. But before I get too carried away, I do want to introduce a few more players to our cast. LA Hero, which is the precursor to what ended up becoming Animaze Inc. due to a buyout by Manga Entertainment, which is why we see a bunch of people carry on to Animaze, but then we see a bunch of others drop off. I'll get into that later throughout my other episodes. I want to sprinkle these throughout these other episodes. But according to Tom, the way he puts it is Guyver was the first thing they did. It was him, his wife Dorothy, that'd be Dorothy Fahn, his brother Jonathan Fahn, his sister Melissa Fahn, so we'll just call them the Fahn clan, Dan Lorge, Mimi Woods, which we've covered in our Ghost in the Shell episode, David Hart, who I just want to say I love his narration in the first 6 episodes of Guyver, Debbie Rogers, I already mentioned Victor Garcia, and Steve Blum. There are other people as well, but those are the ones that Tom mentioned first and foremost. And of course, I have to re-mention Bob Napton, Ken Iyadomi, Yutaka Masaba, and of course, the legend that was Kevin Seymour. Now, for Guyver, and as I mentioned, I'm changing things up. I'm not going to just recap the story. Go watch the Guyver Bio Booster Armor on YouTube. I will have all of the episodes linked into the actual YouTube channel that I have. I'll have like a playlist for them. It's 12 episodes. I'm going to be talking about the first 3 to 6, just a general overview or how I felt about certain editing techniques. But overall, this is to tell kind of the story using these animes as a timeline, because as I mentioned, Bio Booster was the first. Now, the voice directors for the Guyver Bio Booster Armor are listed as Kevin Seymour, Raymond Garcia, and Robert Napton. Now, of course, pseudonyms be pseudonyms. I will have this all in my archive, but of course, everyone and their mom use pseudonyms because, this wasn't anything flashy. And according to Victor, there were things with the union on why or why not you would actually put your name in the credits. With that being said, let's just get some mainstays out of the way, just per my usual, but I'm going to do a lot more rapid fire this time. So some of the leads for this were Tom Fahn, Victor Garcia, Melissa Fahn, Steve Blum, as I mentioned. You also have Deborah Jean Rogers, Dan Lorge, Mimi Woods, Yutaka Maseba, David Hart, Gary Dubin, and many more. As I mentioned, these will all be on the archive. And the last thing I want to mention for the crew is who mixed all this stuff, because, as I mentioned, it went from a place called The Cave and then to Les Claypool's house. A lot of the stuff that we're hearing in the later releases is Les's mixing, and he is an amazing audio guy. Honestly, everyone that I've seen who has worked with Animaze and LA Hero, Les Claypool, Joe Ramersa, Phil Brewster, Michael McCarty, honestly, phenomenal work across the board, and I will be talking more about them as I get to properties that they worked on. But the first thing I do want to talk about, actually talking about Guyver, is how it was translated. So I had a nice conversation with Victor Garcia, and one of the things that he told me about was how the anime was translated, and how, of course, that was then spoken by the actors. He specifically pointed out a scene in the first episode of Guyver where his character, which is Tetsuro Sagawa, and Tom's character, Sho Fukumachi, were essentially, they were bored, and they said, I'm bored, let's go walk in the woods. And Victor's response was funny. I'm going to paraphrase it, but he said it wasn't natural. And that 2 high school boys wouldn't exactly, say that in English. It doesn't sound right. But, and this is something that he pointed out to me, was there was kind of a divide, and we see this divide even to this day in the dubbing community, which is, what is better? Direct translation, like fully outright, or do you Americanize it, or do you alter it to fit your language? So as an example, Japanese has certain sayings that do not translate well, or certain verbal tics, like in Naruto, databayo was roughly translated to the term like I say which Miley did do in the early seasons of Naruto, but then she dropped it altogether until she had to bring it back for the episode where that tick had to come back for story reasons. I think it had to do with something with Naruto's mom. And in that camp was Kevin Seymour and Raymond Garcia, while on the other camp, tweaking it to fit your, I don't want to say dubisms, was Bob Napton, and he mentioned somebody else. I know Victor was definitely in that camp. But they went and said the lines, and you can go and listen to that in the first episode. I will have a link to the first episode of Guyver and the playlist for Guyver attached to whichever listening place you are, so just check the description, you'll find it. But I do want to discuss a bit about the actors and their performances in the first few episodes. As I said, I'm covering the first 6 episodes, and right off the bat, you can tell it's an old dub. You can tell it was a product of its time, and if you were to stand it up to later Animaze dubs or other dubs, like mid-2000s, you can tell. You can tell. But you can't run without walking. And right out the gate, you can tell that the leads really did put in their all. And according to Victor and Tom, and many that I talked to, they said, when recording, you'd record out of order, specifically to make sure your throat wasn't damaged when you had to do the screaming sections. And with that being said, Tom had to do a lot of screaming. Everyone did. I think Tom, Steve, if he did any creature voices, any of the creatures, of course, had to scream. But Tom, screaming out Guyver at the top of his lungs, I do not pity the guy. That took a lot, probably, and probably blew out his lungs a few different times. But I digress, and I will circle back. I do want to tell some of what Tom told me. I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but I do love how this was kind of shotgunned. I really liked it. So as I mentioned earlier, Guyver was the first anime that they dubbed. Victor Garcia gathered them all together. Essentially, he was approached, asking, do you know actors? And Victor was like, yeah, I know actors. And he gathered a bunch of them from Empire Entertainment. And as I mentioned, they worked in the mailroom, as all great startup stories are. As I mentioned earlier, Tom shotgunned the same names I gave you: Victor, himself, Melissa, Jonathan, Dorothy, Steve Blum, Deborah, David Hart, Dan Lorge, Mimi. I'm repeating myself. As he double backs, he says it was the beginning. And he notes that Guyver, and I'm going to quote him here, it was the show boys watched secretly with their dads or uncles or older brothers. It's definitely a lot more violent, a lot of blood, but I think it's a really good show, and my son's been watching it with me too for this research, just on and off while he's eating. A lot of screaming. He did mistype screening, which I thought was hilarious. One of his fun little things was he didn't realize until much later that his character's love interest, which is Sho Fukumachi, was voiced by his sister, Melissa, and that each of them was trying to find their way as an actor, so everything came off very truthful and very raw, which honestly I really appreciated. It's why I think one of my favorite performances in the whole anime was Victor Garcia's as the best friend. He just felt the most real. Like, I can imagine that. On top of that, I mentioned, and I double-checked my notes, it was called The Cave Studios in the Valley. And as well, production was also finding their way. As I mentioned, it was his first recorded. I mentioned also it wasn't done correctly, so they were recording together. So it had to be remixed later by Les at his home studio. So, and I love how he puts, and I'm not even making this up, it says saved ! And the last thing Tom kind of nailed down to me is it's the one show that he is constantly surprised anyone remembers, because it was his first anime, and to that, everything I listed just then is everything that Tom finds special with this anime, with Guyver. And to be honest, I can see why. Like, I can't do Tom's love for this show justice for the simple fact that I wasn't there, and he lived it. They all did. And even after all this time, they remember it. They're still connected by it. I remember digging out some more photos for Kevin's memorial page, and I ended up finding a picture of Steve Blum and Victor Garcia at Kevin Seymour's memorial. And just the stories Victor told me about, them working together before LA Hero, it paints the picture of the humanity that this whole production had. Of course there's going to be actor drama. It's Hollywood. It's California. My mom was an actress in theater. So I'm very much well aware of, I'll just call it theater drama. And so listening to these stories from Victor, from Tom, and just as a little tidbit, I am hopefully going to be talking to Jonathan and Mimi Woods, among others, to really fill in this early era of LA Hero a little bit more. I know there isn't a lot because LA Hero got purchased by Manga Entertainment not too long after they started dubbing. I think they dubbed about 5 animes before they got it. And let's see if I can remember them. I think it was, of course, Macross 2, Guyver, Orgus, Ambassador Magma. I'm blanking on the 5th. But those 5, and then, of course, you start seeing the transition over to animes. You see a lot more of Less Than Mary in the credits. And unfortunately, whenever LA Hero got purchased out by Manga Entertainment, that's when Victor and a bunch of them got let go by the parent company. They just got let go. They got laid off. And so that's why you don't see them in the later productions of these later shows, which is sad. I kind of wish I would have heard more of Victor's performances and some of the others. Even like David Hart had a phenomenal voice, and I'm bummed. I gotta ask Victor on why he didn't reprise his role as narrator in the back half of Guyver. And speaking of Victor, he told me a lot of different things, and I'm still talking with him, and I want to get him on the show so bad. He's just a very busy guy. He works at Universal in their restoration department, which I respect as a person who loves film and who appreciates film. Just being able to talk to somebody who appreciates film as much as I do, and just I think we talked more about, or equally about, film as we have about Kevin. And I know if we do have an interview, it will probably be short, but I know he'll be better at telling the stories that I've kind of conveyed on this episode, and then some. Regardless, I do want to give a quick synopsis of what Guyver is all about, and this is going to be from the back of the DVD box that Manga Video released. When high school student Sho unwittingly activates a mysterious alien weapon, he is transformed into the Guyver, a powerful mechanized warrior. He must now defend mankind against the Zoonoids, devastating creatures created by an ancient alien race as a result of a DNA experiment gone terribly wrong. Now, that sounds amazing, but it sure as heck does not beat Catnapped box, where talking about Bonapole Wit and Boobarina, but Catnapped has a special place, and I think it was mentioned during my interview with Dorothy, with Tom and Dorothy Fahn. Please go check out that interview. I had a lot of fun chatting with them. But Dorothy's first male role was Catnapped, which I find very funny considering now she can pretty solidly do both, even though I think her favorite role, what she said in the interview, was from Trigun. Now, before I go spoil that interview, I do want to bring up a few more things that I forgot to mention earlier about Guyver. I actually do have the recording dates. According to Guyver 1's ADR script, which I will have linked in the description, it says that it was recorded on December 1st, 1991. There are a lot of drafts, a lot of red pens, a lot of markings, a lot of different translations. Now, all these were found on WorthPoint, which was the website that I was able to find a lot of the estate sale stuff from Kevin Seymour's estate. Now, I am working to see how much of his estate I can find physically. I know I have a few connections I'm working with right now, but there are 4 pages. Each have different Guyver production script notes, all sorts of stuff, and it, labeled as books Nippon. It looks like it's scripts for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, among other things. I'm hoping to see what I can find and kind of sift through, but the demo images are very helpful. But when I'm looking at these images, I see a lot of the precursors to what I end up seeing in the later scripts. The pen markings with all the different names, some of the coloring and the highlighting. Now, I'm not seeing the different color highlighters that were used in later scripts, but those do show up later in future scripts, including the Animaze ones that we see later. But I could drove on about the fact that I will probably never get to physically look at some of these scripts unless I'm able to get this podcast really big and I'm have more eyes able to track down some of these director scripts that Kevin, Robert, Mary, all these people worked on. Just having one of them would be an absolute honor, and being able to keep that preserved and be able to look through it, because that's a piece of anime history right here. But let me just talk about the first few episodes of Guyver, specifically Genesis of the Guyver, Battle of the Guyver, Mysterious Shadow, Attack of the Hyperzoanoid Team 5, Death of the Guyver, and finally Terminal Battle, The Fall of Kronos, Japan. Now, I wanted to talk about these 3 to 6 episodes, and I'll be talking about them in the next part of this, because yes, I think I'm going to make this a 2-parter potentially if I have more to talk about with the back half of episodes, or if I want to touch on the series as a whole. I wanted this episode to focus more on some of the stories I've heard and where Guyver fits in on all of this. With that being said, Genesis of the Guyver, pretty straightforward episode, is about show finding the Guyver. Battle of the Guyver, as it says, fighting with the Guyver. Honestly, the show itself is very much, it gives me, I don't want to say Power Rangers vibes, but Ultraman, or even like Kamen Rider, but I definitely lean more towards Ultraman. But the way it synopsis everything is, there'd be a new threat to the Guyver to show to his friends, specifically his best friend and his best friend's sister, which is his love interest. He would go Guyver, potentially learn a new move, and repeat. A lot of screaming, a lot of blood. Don't want to spoil anything, but there's some story elements that I wouldn't normally see in normal animes. So go ahead and check it out. As I said, I'll have that linked in the description. First episode. Honestly, watch the first 3. If you don't like it, you can stop. It's not for everyone, but it's a piece of anime history. Now, I can't go over every story, not yet anyways, and to be honest, I'm happy about that. It means that I will always have something new to talk about. I know I held it a little bit back from this episode to discuss in the next episode, and I want to give a full retrospect of Guyver as a series and how it was mixed as a whole. Just to mention a few key notes from the first episodes is, of course, I mentioned the narration was phenomenal. How that was done was amazing. How the Guyvers themselves, because you can either, there's 2 ways to distort your voice, especially back then. It was either things like pickle jars or other things that you would have in the booth with you, or you'd have to do it in post, which easier said than done, especially if it was recorded at the cave like this was. So you're having bleed through from the other actors, which just shows you how much work Les did to make it so you don't even hear that bleed over. Of course, the other thing that I'll also mention, that I mentioned with every single one of these episodes, is the wallas. There weren't a lot of them, but the wallas that they did and the people that were in them, they were distinct enough. And to be honest, I'm always a sucker for a good walla. And for those who don't know what a walla is, if this is your first time hearing the term, it's usually when you get multiple actors together, at least back in the day, or nowadays everyone will record separately, and it's usually your crowd stuff. So in crowds or background noise, stuff like that. So like in Ghost in the Shell, you had the market. I almost called it a night market, like the fish market, where you could hear all this natural sounding crowd. That had to be recorded by a group of people, of course, and they'd usually do it in a booth about the size of a phone booth. In my interview with the Fahns, with Tom and Dorothy, they mentioned the first time they ever met Michael Sorich. Super sweet guy, by the way. Met him at a show a few months ago. It was him, and he told me this story too, where it was him and Tom and Dorothy in a booth, and you crack door for air, CDFA. So I don't know if that's how it was like in the cave. I don't think it was. I think they were definitely close together, but because, as I mentioned, they were recording near each other, there was going to be that bleed through. But I can always double check with Victor and get back to y'all. And lastly, I want to touch on is the voiceover, the voice acting. As Tom mentioned, it was very raw. And you can tell, even himself, he was raw. And the show did sound a bit goofy, but I think that really added to the endearment of the character. I mentioned Victor sounded the most genuine out of the bunch. You had, Steve Blum, a very young Steve Blum compared to today. His voice isn't as, you can tell it's Steve Blum's voice, but he'd already cut his teeth with music prior to this, so he knew how to throw it, like he played some of the creature voices. But as you act for longer and longer, your voice becomes, it changes over time because the vocal cords are a muscle. So hearing him back then in 91 versus, something like 2025, 2026, there is a distinguishable difference. I mentioned Melissa. Sounds like, Melissa Fahn, if you don't know, was in Bebop, probably one of her bigger roles as Edward or Ed. So she has a distinctive enough voice. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you had Dan Lorge, Mimi Woods, bunch of actors, did phenomenal. I will say some of the character work was a product of its time and effort. So as these actors got better, their acting got better, but their first work isn't going to be their best work. Just like my podcast, my first episode is not going to be my best episode. And this episode is not going to be my best episode. It's going to take me cutting my teeth with this, with my voice, how I act, how I portray, in order to become better. As we start wrapping up this episode of Animazing, I do want to say thank you, Tom, for interviewing me and for continuing to communicate with me afterwards, helping me get in contact with some of these original actors and producers. I want to thank Victor Garcia again for talking to me, for honestly giving me a shot. I didn't think I was going to make it this far. I was going to do this. I was going to be persistent about it, but the gates that I've been able to get through because y'all have given me a chance, it reflects honestly the stories that I'm hearing and how many of y'all got y'all start in this industry due to being given a shot. And so from the bottom of my heart, I do want to say thank you so much. And to those who are continually listening, thank you for being patient with me. I know this episode did not come out last Friday. This is actually going to be going up probably in the next, Wednesday, Thursday, when this is done and edited. But I am excited to continue being back and recording. A few last minute announcements for those who are here to the end. Hello. I will be starting in March traveling the country for shows, for work. I do audio, sound systems, and IT work for the NostalgiaCon, which I've had the privilege to meet many of these actors in person, including Tom and Dorothy before I was even doing this project. I also work some local cons in my local city, but this does not take away from the energy I'm going to be putting into the show, and if I need to record on the road, this equipment is basically the same model as the equipment that I use for the shows, so I might be recording some of these episodes in my hotel room. Lastly, thank you, fellow listeners. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank my wife, my son, and my family for making all this possible. And honestly, I continue looking forward to telling this story. I want to thank Tom one last time for giving me the push to start at the beginning. From starting at LA Hero, from starting at Books Nippon, starting, at the beginning of Kevin Seymour's journey. Because to be honest, where else do you start a story if not from the beginning? Now, this does not mean I will not be talking about later animes. At this point, I want to start talking about Code Geass, which is my favorite of Kevin's, of Mary's, of all theirs. but I'm going to sprinkle those episodes in with these episodes, so I have kind of a back and forth of the beginning and near the end. As we wrap up, y'all might be wondering when the next episode is going to be. I'm going to try and get another one out in a week and a half. It depends on a few factors with potential interviews or even with how I want to cover Guyver. Now, thank you and stay tuned for more. Kevin, take us away.